What if history is not a fixed record, but a fragile memory, shaped as much by silence as by what survives? Imagine standing in a vast archive at night. Shelves stretch into darkness. Boxes are labeled, dated, sealed. Some are neatly cataloged, others are missing. You can feel it before you know it, the sense that something important is not here. Not lost exactly, removed, set aside, quieted. We grow up believing history is a steady march of facts, dates memorized, names engraved, events summarized in clean paragraphs. Yet history is not written by time alone. It is filtered by institutions, by fear, by convenience, by power. What reaches us is often what was allowed to remain. This story begins not with a single event, but with a pattern. Again and again, across decades and continents, moments of profound human consequence slip from the official record. Not erased by accident, but gently pressed out of view, sometimes with intention, sometimes with relief. The question is not whether mistakes were made. All societies make mistakes. The deeper question is what happens after, when truths are buried, softened, or postponed until those responsible are gone and those harmed are too tired or too few to be heard. In the early 20th century, America told itself a story of progress, of industry, innovation, and rising power. It was a comforting narrative, and for many, a true one. But beneath it were other stories, communities thriving quietly, then vanishing overnight. Decisions made behind closed doors, experiments conducted in the name of knowledge, without consent, without voices. These stories did not disappear because they lacked evidence. They vanished because evidence alone is not enough. Records can be classified, testimony can be dismissed, newspapers can choose silence. And when silence lasts long enough, it begins to feel like truth. Time plays a role here. As years pass, urgency fades, survivors age, documents yellow. The past becomes abstract, easier to frame as misunderstanding rather than intention. When truth finally emerges, it often arrives labeled as history, interesting, tragic, but safely distant. Yet distance does not dissolve meaning. A wound does not vanish because it is old. This narrative is not about villains hiding in shadows or secret hands controlling the world. That framing is too simple, too dramatic. Reality is quieter, more human. It is about systems designed to protect themselves, about incentives that reward forgetting, about the subtle ways institutions close ranks, not always out of malice, but out of habit. It is also about courage, about individuals who noticed the absence and spoke anyway, who walked into rooms where they were not expected to tell the truth, and did. Some were believed, many were not. Their voices lingered, waiting for a moment when the world might listen differently. What follows is a journey through moments that challenge our comfort with the past, not to provoke outrage, but reflection, not to accuse, but to understand how easily the record of human experience can be shaped. As listeners, we are not jurors. We are witnesses, arriving late, piecing together fragments, learning to read between the lines. The task is not to reject history, but to approach it with humility. To accept that what we were taught may be incomplete and that incompleteness carries consequences. If knowledge is power, then ignorance is not neutral. It has weight. It affects who is remembered, who is honored, and who remains invisible. This is not a story about losing faith in truth. It is about deepening our relationship with it, about learning to sit with uncertainty, about recognizing that history is not finished speaking if we are willing to listen. So we begin with a simple, unsettling thought. Not everything that shaped our world made it into the story we were told. And once you notice what is missing, the silence itself begins to speak. What else might be waiting in the gaps? It began with whispers on Wall Street, urgent conversations held behind thick oak doors where power had grown impatient with democracy. The year was 1933. The Great Depression had gripped the United States, unraveling fortunes and exposing the fragility of wealth. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal sought to stabilize the country through sweeping reforms, protections for workers, oversight of banks, and support for the unemployed. For millions, it was hope. For a handful of powerful men, it was war. They were the captains of industry, bankers, chemical magnates, arms manufacturers, men whose empires spanned continents. To them, Roosevelt's reforms were not rescue. They were rebellion. If the country moved toward equality, they believed, it would move away from them. Their plan was bold and chilling. Install a military dictatorship in the United States. March on Washington with 500,000 veterans. Dismantle the presidency. Replace it with a figurehead they could control. It would mirror the rise of fascism in Europe, efficient, hierarchical, profitable. But to lead the charge, they needed someone beloved, a war hero, a patriot, someone who could rally soldiers with a single command. They chose Major General Smedley Butler, twice decorated with the Medal of Honor, revered by veterans and feared by none. To them, he was the ideal puppet, but they didn't understand who he truly was. Butler listened. He let them speak. They offered funds, power, allegiance. But when the meetings ended, he did not march on Washington. He went to Congress. In 1934, he testified before the House Un-American Activities Committee, revealing the conspiracy in stunning detail. Names, amounts, tactics. The committee confirmed it. There had been an organized attempt to overthrow the government. Evidence included transcripts, financial records, and corroboration from the intermediary who had approached Butler. But the response was silence. No arrests were made. No trials held. The final report, damning and explicit, was buried. Newspapers, owned or influenced by those implicated, downplayed or ignored the story. The press turned away. The nation moved on. Why? Perhaps because the accused were too powerful. Perhaps because the system feared what full exposure might unleash. A coup unmasked might undermine faith in the very fabric of the republic. Butler, the would-be figurehead turned whistleblower, returned to a quieter life. His warning, once headline-worthy, became a footnote. For decades, historians doubted his account, until classified documents released in the 1970s proved he had told the truth. By then, the conspirators were long dead. Their businesses had thrived. Their names adorned foundations and institutions. And the idea that American democracy had once stood on the edge of internal betrayal remained almost entirely absent from textbooks. This is not a story of a failed coup alone. It is a story about what happens when truth is too heavy to carry, when the cost of accountability feels greater than the crime. Butler once described war as a racket, a game played by the rich, fought by the poor. In turning down the plot, he chose principle over power, but even his courage could not undo the silence that followed. We are left with a question. What other truths were buried not because they lacked proof, but because they arrived at a time when no one was ready to hear them? And when history is shaped not by what happened, but by what is remembered, what does that say about us? In a quiet Pentagon office in 1962, a plan was laid on the table that could have rewritten American history, not by chance but by design. It was called Operation Northwoods. At first glance, it read like the script of a Cold War thriller. Staged attacks on American cities, civilian casualties, hijacked planes, bombings, and false flags, all orchestrated not by a foreign enemy, but by the highest levels of the United States military. The target wasn't an adversary overseas. It was the American public's trust, and the intent was to manipulate it. The Cold War had reached a fever pitch. Cuba, under Fidel Castro, had become a thorn in Washington's side. After the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, the appetite for another confrontation grew behind closed doors, but public support was tepid. The solution? Manufacture a justification. The Joint Chiefs of Staff proposed a campaign of staged violence. They would sink boats filled with Cuban refugees, bomb cities like Miami and Washington, hijack planes and crash them. They even suggested targeting students on holiday. Young lives lost to create the image of a ruthless enemy. The attacks would be blamed on Castro. A trail of fabricated evidence would lead to Havana, and outrage would do the rest. The public would demand retaliation. War would become inevitable and justified. The president at the time, John F. Kennedy, was horrified. He rejected the proposal outright. Not long after, he began efforts to replace the chairman of the Joint Chiefs who had helped draft the plan. The documents detailing Operation Northwoods remained classified for decades, buried under layers of secrecy. It wasn't until 1997 that a researcher, digging through government archives, stumbled upon them through the Freedom of Information Act. What emerged was not speculation. It was proof. Typed memos, tactical outlines, cold bureaucratic language describing how best to kill civilians and shift blame. Casualty lists in U.S. newspapers, one line read, would cause a helpful wave of indignation. This wasn't the plan of rogue operatives. It was unanimously approved by the Joint Chiefs. The highest-ranking military officials in the country had been willing to orchestrate terror to steer public opinion. And yet, when the document surfaced, there was no reckoning, no hearings, no apologies. The story flickered briefly in news reports, then faded. It was history, but somehow not part of the story we told ourselves, perhaps because it asked too much of us. To believe that trust could be so deeply betrayed, that patriotism could be weaponized, that democracy could be manipulated from within. What does it mean when truth is only revealed because someone misfiles a box of papers? And if that box had never been opened, would we have ever known? This chapter is not about paranoia. It's about potential. What institutions are capable of, not in theory, but in practice, when power seeks its own ends? It reminds us that not all threats come from beyond our borders. Some begin in boardrooms, in briefings, in quiet moments where ethics give way to strategy. And it forces us to ask, how many moments in our history were shaped by forces the public never saw? If a democracy can be manipulated through fear, what safeguards remain? When truth is classified and memory is managed, who decides what we believe? These questions are not relics. They echo still. And they ask us, quietly but insistently, what else don't we know? It began with a false accusation and ended in fire. On the night of May 31, 1921, the skies above Tulsa, Oklahoma, glowed red. Flames devoured homes and businesses. Smoke curled into the stars. In the Greenwood district, known then as Black Wall Street, dreams turned to ash. Greenwood had been a marvel, a thriving black community built on resilience, entrepreneurship, and self-reliance. Banks, hotels, hospitals, newspapers, and schools, all black-owned, all successful. In a segregated America, Greenwood was a rare place of possibility. But that success came with a price: resentment. When a young black man was accused of assaulting a white woman, an accusation later discredited, white mobs gathered outside the courthouse. Black veterans, many of them heroes of World War I, arrived to protect the accused from lynching. A scuffle broke out, a shot rang, then chaos. But what followed was not a riot. It was an invasion. White mobs, some deputized by city officials, swept into Greenwood. They carried rifles and torches. They burned churches and clinics. They looted homes. Survivors would later describe bombs, makeshift fire bombs dropped from planes, making this one of the first aerial attacks on civilians in U.S. history. In 24 hours, 35 city blocks were erased. As many as 300 people were killed. Over 10,000 were left homeless. Families who had built wealth over generations lost everything in a single day. No white attacker was ever charged. No restitution was paid. Insurance companies refused to honor claims, and when survivors emerged from hiding, they were arrested and held in internment camps. Then came the silence. Newspapers cut the story from their archives. Police reports vanished. State officials scrubbed records. In schools, Tulsa's darkest day was never taught. Survivors were silenced through fear and intimidation. For decades, Black Wall Street lived only in memory, passed down in hushed tones, too painful and too dangerous to speak aloud. It wasn't until the late 1990s that the silence cracked. Investigators, prompted by community pressure, began searching for truth beneath the soil. Ground-penetrating radar revealed mass graves. Eyewitness accounts were finally recorded. A commission was formed, but by then, most survivors were gone. And still, for many Americans, this story remained unknown until a television series, a fictional show, brought it into the public eye in 2019. That was how history returned. Not through textbooks, but through entertainment. The Tulsa Massacre was not an aberration. It was a warning. A demonstration of what can happen when justice bends to power, when law enforcement becomes complicit, and when truth is buried alongside its victims. The Greenwood story asks us to reconsider what we mean when we say American history. Is it only what we celebrate, or also what we hide? It forces us to confront how race, power, and memory are entangled. That progress, when built outside the bounds of white supremacy, has often been met not with recognition, but with ruin. And that forgetting is not passive, it is an act. To erase is to protect the status quo. To silence is to preserve comfort. But to remember, to truly remember, is to resist. As we revisit this lost chapter, we must ask, how many Greenwoods were there? How many communities disappeared with no cameras, no commissions, no one left to tell the story? And if we only hear about injustice once it's dramatized, how many real lives remain invisible? The ashes of Black Wall Street are not just a relic, they are a mirror, and what we choose to see in it will shape the stories we dare to tell next. The room was silent but charged, like a storm about to break. In 1975, the United States Congress held hearings that pulled back a curtain Americans had never been meant to look behind. What they uncovered felt more like science fiction than national history. For over 2 decades, the CIA had conducted secret experiments on unwitting citizens. The goal? To control the human mind. The program had a name, MKUltra. It began in the 1950s, during the height of the Cold War. American officials, rattled by reports of Soviet brainwashing, feared the enemy had found a way to control thoughts. The CIA's answer was to try and develop its own methods, methods that ignored morality, legality, and consent. Over the years, MKUltra spread like a hidden fungus. 80 institutions were involved: universities, hospitals, prisons, and pharmaceutical companies. Its reach was wide, its subjects vulnerable: mental patients, prisoners, addicts, even children. People who wouldn't be believed. People who didn't even know they were being studied. Test subjects were dosed with LSD without their knowledge. Some were placed in sensory deprivation tanks. Others were subjected to extreme electroshock therapy, sleep deprivation, hypnosis, and forced drug overdoses. The goal was to break the mind, erase identity, and rebuild it to order. One doctor in Canada conducted what he called psychic driving. His patients, many seeking help for anxiety or depression, were drugged, kept unconscious for weeks, and made to listen to the same recorded messages for hours on end. When they woke, they didn't recognize their families. They had to relearn how to walk, talk, even use the bathroom. When MKUltra was officially terminated in 1973, the CIA director ordered all documents destroyed. What survived by chance had been misfiled in a financial folder. That error, the humankind, let history glimpse the full horror. Congress demanded answers. The public recoiled, but the story didn't end there. Declassified documents in the 1980s and 1990s revealed other programs had taken MKUltra's place, under new names with tighter secrecy. Whistleblowers and survivors came forward. Their stories echoed the old ones. In one sub-project, agents operated brothels in New York and San Francisco. They lured clients, secretly drugged them, and observed their behavior through one-way mirrors. The program continued years after MKUltra was supposedly shut down. And in 2010, a presidential bioethics commission confirmed that non-consensual experiments, including exposure to nerve agents and psychoactive drugs, had continued into the 21st century, particularly in military populations. Through it all, there were no indictments, no apologies, no reparations. Victims were dismissed or forgotten. The institutions that carried out the experiments remained intact, their names unblemished. Why does this matter now? Because the legacy of MKUltra is not just the pain it caused. It's the precedent it set. It showed that in the name of national security, ethics could be suspended, that the human mind could be turned into a battlefield, and that battlefield could be anywhere. It reminds us that secrecy is not always about protection. Sometimes it's about what must be hidden to continue. And it asks us quietly, if trust is broken at the level of the self, if even your thoughts aren't safe from manipulation, what does that mean for freedom? This story is not meant to inspire fear. It's meant to invite vigilance. Because the most dangerous lies are the ones we tell ourselves, especially when they sound like protection, especially when they come stamped with a seal that says, classified. There are moments in history when the truth breaks through by accident, like a letter slipped under the wrong door or a locked cabinet left ajar. In 1971, a group of ordinary citizens broke into an FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania. Their goal was simple: expose government surveillance of anti-war activists. What they found was something far more disturbing. Among the stolen documents was a single word: COINTELPRO. That word would unravel a secret program, 15 years long, that waged psychological warfare not on foreign enemies, but on American citizens. From 1956 to 1971, the FBI ran a covert counterintelligence operation designed to disrupt, discredit, and neutralize domestic political groups. The targets were not terrorists or spies. They were civil rights leaders, students, indigenous organizers, anti-war demonstrators, women's rights advocates, anyone whose voice challenged the status quo. The tactics were chilling. Agents infiltrated peaceful groups and encouraged violence. They sent anonymous letters to stir suspicion and conflict. They created false evidence, doctored photographs, and forged documents. One goal: to fracture trust from within. Against the Black Panthers, the tactics were especially brutal. Agents spread rumors that members were informants, igniting paranoia that led to deadly internal conflict. In one notorious case, the FBI provided police with a detailed map of a leader's apartment, then drugged his drink hours before a raid. He was killed in his sleep. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was another target. The FBI bugged his hotel rooms, recorded his private conversations, and sent him a letter urging him to commit suicide. The message was explicit: "You are done." It arrived just weeks before he was to receive the Nobel Peace Prize. When COINTELPRO was exposed, the public reaction was shock, but not justice. The FBI director denied the full extent. Some documents were released, most were not. And while the program was officially terminated, Later disclosures revealed its tactics were simply rebranded under different initiatives. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, activists continued to report surveillance and infiltration. After 9/11, the pattern repeated. Environmentalists, anti-war protesters, and journalists found themselves under the same lens: watched, manipulated, targeted. No agent was prosecuted. No victims were compensated. The agency offered no apology. What makes COINTELPRO so insidious is not only what it did, but how it reshaped activism itself. When organizers fear infiltration, they hesitate. When voices are silenced through fear of surveillance, movements stall. When truth becomes a liability, fewer people are willing to speak it. This program was not about national security. It was about control, about shaping the narrative of dissent to look like danger, about ensuring that power remained undisturbed. And it was successful. To this day, the idea of extremism is used to justify monitoring of voices that question authority. The legacy of COINTELPRO lives not just in redacted files, but in the quiet self-censorship it instilled across generations. This chapter of history invites a hard question. Can democracy truly thrive when those who dare to challenge it are treated as enemies of the state? And if activism can be criminalized by paperwork, by rumor, by whispers in sealed offices, what does that say about the strength of the freedoms we claim to protect? The Constitution guarantees rights. But history reminds us those rights are only as safe as the hands that hold them, and sometimes those hands wear badges. They were patients, prisoners, soldiers. They came for help or had no choice at all. What they received instead was disease, deliberately given, quietly studied, and silently buried for over 60 years. Between 1946 and 1948, the United States government conducted medical experiments in Guatemala that sound unthinkable. Nearly 1,500 people were intentionally infected with syphilis, gonorrhea, and other venereal diseases, without consent, without knowledge, and without treatment. This wasn't a rogue operation. It was organized, funded, and approved at the highest levels of the U.S. Public Health Service. The methods were chilling. Sex workers, themselves infected, were paid to visit prisoners and soldiers. When that proved too slow, researchers switched to direct inoculation, injecting pathogens into men's arms, spines, and genitals. In mental institutions, patients were intentionally wounded so bacteria could be rubbed into open flesh. Some were tied down. Most were never treated. The goal was not to cure, but to observe. Researchers wanted to track disease progression, not healing, and they chose their subjects carefully, people who couldn't say no and whom no one was likely to defend. What makes this even more disturbing is the timing. These experiments began just as the world was putting Nazi doctors on trial for war crimes. While the Nuremberg Code was being written, defining the ethics of human experimentation, American doctors were quietly violating every principle it laid out. At the center of it all was a physician who had previously been involved in another infamous study, the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, where black men in Alabama were deliberately left untreated for decades. When that program became too controversial, he took his work to Guatemala, where scrutiny was even less likely. The entire project was hidden. Reports were classified. Publications omitted any mention of deliberate infection. Even the Guatemalan government wasn't told the truth. For over 6 decades, the victim's suffering was buried beneath bureaucratic silence. Then, in 2005, a researcher stumbled upon boxes of forgotten papers, correspondence, photos, and records that detailed the experiments in haunting clarity. It took 5 more years before the truth became public. In 2010, the U.S. government formally apologized, but the apology was narrow, words without justice. There were no trials, no reparations, no official admission of criminal wrongdoing. When the Guatemalan government sued for damages, a U.S. court dismissed the case, citing sovereign immunity. The victims received nothing. What this chapter reveals is not just an atrocity, but a mechanism, the machinery that enables such crimes: vulnerable populations, institutional secrecy, legal protections for perpetrators, and a national narrative that prefers discomfort to accountability. These were not isolated mistakes. They were choices, made repeatedly, and hidden with precision. And perhaps most troubling, the structures that made them possible remain intact. Classification systems, legal loopholes, the idea that in the name of science or security, some lives are more expendable than others. The Guatemalan experiments are a reminder that history is not always distant, that ethics are not guaranteed, and that apologies, when unaccompanied by justice, can feel like salt rather than balm. So we are left with the question, if this could happen, if it did happen, and remain hidden for so long, how many other stories still wait in sealed boxes, in locked archives, in whispered memories? And what does it say about us as a society if those stories are never heard? A shot rang out and history shifted. It was 1968. A civil rights leader, whose voice had stirred a generation, lay dying on a motel balcony in Memphis. Officially, the case was closed quickly. A lone gunman, a single bullet. Justice served. But behind the headlines, a different narrative lingered, murkier, fragmented, and fiercely protected from the light. For decades, the story of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination remained sealed in certainty. But the cracks were always there. Declassified documents, courtroom testimony, and the voices of those closest to the event paint a far more complex picture, one that points not just to a shooter, but to a system. The FBI's obsession with Dr. King was well documented. He was labeled the most dangerous man in America. Agents bugged his hotel rooms, mailed him blackmail letters, and compiled private recordings to use against him. But after King spoke out against the Vietnam War and began organizing a national Poor People's Campaign, the campaign against him escalated. In 1999, decades after the killing, something extraordinary happened. A civil court in Memphis revisited the assassination. Over 6 weeks, 70 witnesses testified. The jury's conclusion was stunning. Government agencies, they found, were part of a conspiracy to kill Dr. King. This was not a fringe opinion. It was a legal verdict. Yet it barely made headlines. Eyewitnesses recalled seeing military personnel in Memphis the week of the assassination. Intelligence units were on the ground. The building from which the fatal shot was allegedly fired was crawling with unacknowledged operatives. A restaurant owner beneath that boarding house later claimed on national television that he had been paid to participate in a cover-up. He named a local police officer as the real shooter. His confession was dismissed, never fully investigated. Even the physical evidence raised questions. Ballistic tests were inconclusive. Fingerprints on the rifle didn't match how the weapon would have been fired. Multiple witnesses heard gunfire from directions inconsistent with the official story. Perhaps most telling is what happened after the assassination. Within hours, the FBI took control of the investigation, seizing evidence, sidelining local authorities. Witnesses who offered alternative accounts were ignored or intimidated. The man arrested for the crime initially pleaded guilty under duress, then immediately recanted. He died in prison, insisting he had been set up. The King family publicly supported his efforts for a new trial. They met with him. They said they believed he was not the killer. But no federal investigation reopened the case. No new inquiry pursued the leads. The narrative, once written, remained sealed. Why does this matter? Because Dr. King's legacy has been softened over time, rendered safe, celebrated in quotes and holidays. But his final years were radical. He challenged militarism, capitalism, and racial injustice at their roots. He was moving toward a different kind of revolution, one not just of race but of class and power. That made him dangerous. The silence around his death reflects something deeper than historical oversight. It reflects how institutions protect themselves, how justice can be curated, how memory can be sculpted into something easier to admire but harder to confront. This chapter of the story is not about solving a mystery. It's about recognizing the limits of the stories we are allowed to tell. When a man who preached nonviolence is killed violently, and those who may have been responsible are never questioned, what does that say about accountability? And when truth arrives decades too late, barely noticed, barely believed, can it still change anything? Or is the real power not in the story itself, but in who gets to end it? It happened in the quiet halls of hospitals, in prison cells, in classrooms for disabled children. For 30 years, from the 1940s to the 1970s, Americans were subjected to radiation experiments, without their knowledge, without their consent. And almost no one knew. The experiments were part of a vast government effort to understand the effects of radiation on the human body. Justified as preparation for nuclear war, the research was often brutal, and it was buried in layers of secrecy that lasted half a century. At a prestigious university, 829 pregnant women were given what they were told were vitamin drinks. In truth, they contained radioactive iron. Researchers wanted to see how radiation crossed the placental barrier. The results showed elevated cancer rates in both mothers and their children. At a state school in Massachusetts, mentally disabled boys were fed radioactive oatmeal. They were told they were part of a science club. Their parents signed permission slips, but the forms never mentioned radiation. The research was funded by a major food company and a respected university. In hospitals across the country, terminally ill patients were injected with plutonium. Some thought they were receiving new treatments. They were not. The purpose was to study how radioactive substances move through the body. Consent was never sought. In Oregon and Washington state prisons, inmates were paid to have their testicles irradiated. Researchers wanted to know how radiation might affect fertility. Many of the men later developed cancer. Few understood the risks at the time. The experiments were conducted through a network of universities and federal labs. High-ranking government officials, including members of the military and the Atomic Energy Commission, approved the projects. When questions about ethics arose, they were dismissed. One memo recommended classifying all details, warning that public knowledge would have adverse effect on public opinion, so they hid it. Papers were published, but scrubbed of any mention of non-consensual testing. Consent forms were destroyed or forged. Classified stamps locked away the details. It wasn't until the early 1990s that the full scope emerged. A cabinet-level investigation declassified thousands of documents. A presidential advisory committee spent 18 months reviewing the evidence. Their 1995 report confirmed it all. More than 4,000 radiation experiments, many on vulnerable people, most without consent. There was an apology. Settlements were paid to a few victims, but no criminal charges were filed. The institutions that enabled the experiments, hospitals, labs, universities, faced no meaningful consequences. What makes this chapter especially haunting is the contradiction. While America prosecuted Nazi doctors at Nuremberg for unethical human experimentation, it was conducting similar experiments at home. In courtrooms abroad, we said never again. In laboratories at home, we acted as if never again didn't apply here. The radiation experiments reveal how the language of science can be used to justify cruelty, how ethics can be suspended by bureaucratic logic, and how easy it is to rationalize harm when the subjects are poor, sick, imprisoned, or powerless. The legacy of these experiments is not just the pain endured by the victims. It's the precedent set, that in moments of fear or urgency, rights can be redefined and lives can be quietly sacrificed. So we are left with a question. If secrecy can shield such profound violations, what faith can we place in oversight? And when the truth finally comes out, not with outrage but with a shrug, what does that say about the stories we choose to forget? The war was supposed to be over. The Spanish flag had come down. The American one had gone up. But in the Philippines, the promise of liberation quickly turned into something else, something far more violent. From 1899 to 1902, the United States waged a brutal war to suppress the Filipino struggle for independence. Officially, it was called the Philippine Insurrection. In truth, it was a war of conquest marked by massacres, torture, and a colonial ambition rarely acknowledged in American memory. What began as a handshake turned into an occupation. The Filipinos, having fought alongside American forces against Spain, expected self-rule. Instead, they were declared unfit for independence. American troops stayed. Resistance flared. The response was swift and merciless. One U.S. general ordered his soldiers to turn the island of Samar into a howling wilderness, commanding them to kill everyone over the age of 10. His exact words, "I want no prisoners. I wish you to kill and burn. The more you kill and burn, the better it will please me." Entire villages were leveled. Civilians were forced into concentration camps called reconcentration zones, where food and medicine were scarce and disease ran rampant. Tens of thousands died of starvation and illness. The most infamous technique used was called the water cure, an early form of waterboarding. Soldiers would force prisoners to drink gallons of water, then beat or stomp on their stomachs to expel it violently. The process was repeated until the victim confessed or died. Letters home from American soldiers described the horror in stark terms. One private wrote, "We make everyone get into his house, and then we set fire to every house in sight." Another admitted to shooting wounded prisoners. When reports of atrocities reached the United States, there was public outcry. Congressional hearings were held, officers were court-martialed, but the punishments were minimal. The general who had ordered mass killing was retired honorably. Others were acquitted. The government worked to manage the narrative. Journalists critical of the war were labeled unpatriotic. Military censorship restricted access. Textbooks described the war as a brief insurrection, swiftly and humanely quelled. The true death toll remains uncertain, but estimates range from 200,000 to over 1 million Filipino civilians. Most Americans today have never heard of the war at all. Why? Because acknowledging it would force a confrontation with the darker chapters of American expansion. It would challenge the myth of benevolent empire. It would require admitting that, long before Vietnam, America had practiced counterinsurgency, psychological warfare, and torture on people who once called us allies. In the Philippines, the memory is alive, taught in schools, remembered in family stories. But in the United States, it is a ghost, erased by omission, softened by euphemism, replaced by silence. This forgotten war set a precedent. The strategies developed, village burning, strategic hamlets, enhanced interrogation would echo in later conflicts. But the connection is rarely made because the origin has been carefully removed. So we must ask, what does it mean when the foundations of a modern superpower are built not only on ideals, but on acts it refuses to remember? And if we cannot tell the truth about how an empire begins, how can we ever understand the cost of what it becomes? It started with breakfast, not speeches, not protests, just warm eggs, toast, and orange juice, served before school by volunteers in church basements and community centers. In 1969, a revolutionary organization launched a free breakfast for children program. Within months, it was feeding over 20,000 kids in cities across America. No forms, no proof of poverty, just food. The idea was simple. If the government wouldn't feed hungry children, communities would do it themselves. The program was legal, peaceful, and effective. Teachers noticed the difference. Children focused better, they smiled more, and parents, many for the first time, felt supported by something outside the system. But to the FBI, this was not charity. It was a threat. Internal memos from the Bureau called the breakfast program the greatest threat to the internal security of the United States. Not because it was violent, but because it worked. Because it showed that radical groups could not only protest, but provide. They could build. And that terrified those in power. What followed was a campaign of sabotage. The FBI sent anonymous letters to churches warning that hosting breakfast programs would put children in danger. Inspections were weaponized. Health departments were tipped off with false reports, shutting down kitchens on fabricated violations. Volunteers were harassed. In some cities, police raided breakfast sites while children ate, flipping tables, arresting cooks, confiscating food. The goal wasn't just disruption. It was fear. In Baltimore, reports emerged that food meant for children had been poisoned by federal agents or their associates. In San Francisco, suppliers were pressured to stop donating. In Chicago, a breakfast program was targeted with false criminal charges. Parents were not spared. FBI agents visited homes, implying that allowing children to eat free meals meant supporting subversion. The message was clear. Feeding your child could put you on a government watch list. None of this was rumor. These operations are documented in declassified files, strategies meticulously planned and reported on with bureaucratic precision. Field offices tracked the number of children no longer receiving meals as a measure of success. The goal was not to protect America. It was to prevent a shift in narrative. If a marginalized group could feed the hungry, educate the forgotten, heal the sick, what did that say about the government's own failures? The breakfast program wasn't just about food. It was about dignity, about community, about power from the ground up. And that was intolerable. Eventually, the pressure worked. Churches withdrew, donations dried up, volunteers burned out. Many chapters collapsed under the weight of surveillance and sabotage. The federal government eventually created its own breakfast program in 1975, modeled directly on the one it had tried to destroy. But by then, the damage was done. A grassroots revolution in nutrition and community care had been buried beneath raids, fear, and silence. This chapter forces a fundamental question. What kind of society treats feeding children as a national security threat? When compassion is criminalized and care is seen as subversion, what values are we truly protecting? The story of the Free Breakfast for Children program reminds us that power fears not only protest, but possibility. The kind that comes quietly, at dawn, with a plate of food and the belief that no child should go to school hungry. Not because it's strategic, but because it's right. And if that kind of care is dangerous, then perhaps it's time to redefine what security really means. Some stories don't vanish overnight. They erode slowly, sanded down by time, buried by bureaucracy, dulled by the passing of generations. But when the veil lifts, what lies beneath can still astonish. In 1997, a stack of declassified documents surfaced, each bearing the quiet weight of long-held secrets. Among them were files detailing one of the most chilling plots ever proposed by U.S. military leadership, a campaign of terror, not abroad, but on American soil. We've seen this pattern before: plans drafted, proposals made, threats imagined, and truths withheld. But not all operations faded into obscurity. Some stories kept flickering in the shadows, too outrageous to believe, too documented to deny. The Pentagon's 1962 plan to stage terrorist attacks and blame Cuba, Operation Northwoods, had shocked the public when it was revealed. But it wasn't an anomaly. It was part of a broader mindset that controlling perception was as important as controlling territory. In the years that followed, the playbook expanded. Propaganda disguised as news. Covert operations reframed as accidents. Political opponents branded as threats. Sometimes the weapon was deception. Other times, it was silence. This culture of plausible deniability seeped into countless corners of American history. Military experiments, once confined to secret labs, were mirrored in communities, from Guatemalan hospitals to rural American schools. Radiation tests, drug trials, psychological operations, all conducted with the assumption that those affected would never know, never matter, or never be believed. And the justification? National security. That enduring phrase, capable of bending ethics, suspending rights, and hiding truths for decades. What binds these stories together is not just secrecy, but the machinery that sustains it. Documents marked classified for generations, legal shields like sovereign immunity, institutional reluctance to reopen old wounds, and a culture that rewards forgetting over remembering. Even when facts emerge through whistleblowers, leaked files, or court rulings, the response is often muted. A press release, an apology, a shrug, rarely justice, rarely reform. This isn't about conspiracies, it's about capacity, the demonstrated ability of systems to choose concealment over accountability, and the quiet, enduring consequences that choice leaves behind. Communities affected by these events carry the burden. Survivors grow old, waiting for acknowledgement. Families pass down pain like inheritance. And the rest of society, unaware, untouched, moves on. But every so often, the silence cracks. A name resurfaces. A story is told again. And history shifts, not because the facts changed, but because someone finally listened. This part of the journey is less about revelation and more about reckoning. If institutions can hide these truths for decades, how should we read today's headlines? If history can be edited to serve comfort, what responsibility do we bear in seeking the unedited version? And perhaps the hardest question of all, if these events had never been uncovered, if the wrong file hadn't been found, the wrong lock picked, the wrong person silenced too late, how much would we still not know? The truth, it turns out, has less to do with what happened, and more to do with what we are willing to see. And sometimes, seeing clearly is the most radical act of all. History has a way of rewarding silence. The quieter a truth, the longer it can hide. But sometimes the cover-up becomes part of the story, revealing not just what was done, but the lengths taken to make sure no one ever knew. For decades, the darkest chapters of American policy were protected not just by secrecy, but by architecture, systems built to preserve the illusion of transparency while keeping the truth just out of reach. Documents locked under classification, courts shielding the state through sovereign immunity, a media ecosystem hesitant to challenge official narratives. The tools were subtle, legal, effective. The result was a curated version of history, one where wars were fought for freedom, not profit, where science advanced through consent, not coercion, where dissent was criminalized only when dangerous, not when inconvenient. But the cracks were always there. Whistleblowers who risked everything, survivors who refused silence, researchers who stumbled onto hidden records. The truth never died, it just waited. For someone willing to ask the right question at the wrong time. And when those answers came, they forced a reckoning, not just with the past, but with the present. Because none of these events happened in isolation. They were woven into the fabric of policy, defense, medicine, and law. And the systems that enabled them were never truly dismantled, only rebranded, refined, renamed. That's what makes these stories more than relics. They are warnings. A secret radiation experiment may seem distant now, but what replaced it? What happens when new technologies emerge? Biometric data, AI surveillance, neurostimulation, without adequate safeguards or consent. A suppressed political assassination may feel like history, but what does it say about today's ability to hold power accountable? And when a free breakfast for children is deemed a threat to national security, how should we view efforts to build care and dignity outside of institutional frameworks? These aren't just stories about what happened, they're about what is still possible. Because the architecture of silence still stands. The laws that shield the state. The agencies that answer only to themselves. The narratives that shape public memory like a sculptor shapes clay. And if we assume that what we know is all there is, we risk mistaking the absence of evidence for the evidence of absence. The truth is more fragile than we think. It relies on people who keep asking, who keep remembering, who keep pulling at threads others hope will stay buried. And maybe, most importantly, it relies on us choosing discomfort over denial. Because the past doesn't vanish when ignored. It lingers. In institutions, in communities, in the questions that never stop knocking. So we ask again, how many more truths remain classified, misfiled, erased not by malice, but by convenience? And what would it mean for our history, our politics, our humanity, if we chose to remember what we were taught to forget? What do we call a history built on omissions? We are taught that the past is a record, etched in stone, preserved in textbooks, passed down with pride or regret. But what we've seen is something else, a story sculpted not only by what is included, but by what is left out. And when erasure becomes habit, the silence itself becomes part of the structure. 10 events, 10 buried truths, and countless lives impacted by decisions made in locked rooms, justified in secret, and denied for generations. This is not about nostalgia for a purer past. It's about recognizing that even the most democratic institutions are capable of distortion when it serves survival, image, or control. The question isn't just, how did this happen? It's, how was it allowed to stay hidden? Because each revelation arrived late. Too late for justice, too late for healing. When documents were finally declassified, when testimonies finally aired, the reaction was not action, but fatigue, as if time itself could absolve a system from answering for its choices. Yet these stories are not dead. They echo in the policies we accept, the news we dismiss, the myths we repeat. They live in the gaps between headlines, in the mistrust that colors public discourse, in the unease that whispers, maybe we don't know everything we should. The purpose of looking back isn't to point fingers at ghosts. It's to understand the present with sharper eyes. To see how truth can be shaped, how memory can be molded, and how justice delayed is too often justice denied. But this isn't just a story of suppression. It's also a story of resistance, of the historian who kept asking, the whistleblower who wouldn't stay quiet, the survivor who remembered, the citizen who broke in, not to destroy, but to reveal. Truth does not survive by accident. It survives because people carry it, often alone, often at great cost. And so we end not with certainty, but with invitation, to listen more carefully, to question more deeply, to see the past not as settled, but as alive, still unfolding, still incomplete. Because the final chapter of history is never written. It is revised every time we uncover what was hidden, every time we choose to confront what was buried, every time we ask not just what happened, but why it was forgotten. So perhaps the better question is not, what have we been lied to about? But what are we still not seeing? And if we have the courage to look, really look, what kind of future might remembering make possible?